Professional Development webinar series. In today's webinar, Everett Fritz, author of One Disciple at a Time and president of Andrew Ministries, will explain why Jesus leaves the 99 in search of the one and how we can follow his example by prioritizing ministry that addresses the needs of the individual. My name is Erin Pierce. I'm the publicist at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions can be sent to our presenter using the question section on the GoToWebinar panel that you see here on the slide. And I'll read as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you via email tomorrow. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Everett Fritz, as I mentioned, is founder and executive director of Andrew Ministries, a nonprofit devoted to training parishes in discipleship and family-based youth ministry. He has more than 15 years of experience in youth ministry. He's also the author of Freedom and the Art of Forming Young Disciples and the co-author of Uncompromising Purity. Fritz has been a regular guest on EWTN, Catholic Answers Live, and numerous podcast and radio programs. He's spoken all over the country, presenting on discipleship through missions, retreats, and workshops for dioceses, parishes, schools, and organizations. Fritz earned a bachelor's degree in theology from Franciscan University of Steubenville and a master's degree in theology with concentrations in catechesis and evangelization from the Augustine Institute. Everett, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
Okay. Yep. It'd probably help if I
No worries.
closed out my browser.
There we go.
There we go. All right. Thanks, Erin. So, yeah, I've started giving this talk recently around the country because my apostolate works in youth ministry. I'm a big advocate that the way we're doing youth formation of the church is ineffective and obsolete, and so I do discipleship-focused youth ministry and coach and consult on that area. And frequently I'll give presentations on why young people are leaving the church, or presentations on how we can more effectively minister to young people. And whenever I give that talk, there's always if I'm talking to like a general audience, there's always a line of people at the end that want to talk. And inevitably, the most common question that I get is, what do I do about my adult child who has left the faith? And so, or some sort of variation of that is, I've lost a loved one to the world. They've left the faith. What can I do? And there's a kind of hopelessness about the question, in that we have loved ones. I think most people can identify someone that is a loved one who's left the faith. People in America, United States, 1 in 10 Americans is a former Catholic, which is a staggering amount of people. That's 40 million people. And so, you know, after getting this question many times over, I just started giving presentations on it, because it's like, okay, well, let's talk about that. How do you walk with someone who has left the faith? How do you walk with someone that you love? I want to emphasize a couple of things. Number one is that it's something I call the theory of one. And essentially, the theory of one is that one great saint makes more disciples, has a greater impact on the world than 1,000 mediocre Catholics. And so one of the things that I advocate for when I'm advocating for a change in ministry approach in parishes or in schools or whatever the case may be, is for ministry to be focused more on discipleship, more on the individual needs of a person, that really we have to be focused on the actual work that it takes to make an incredible saint. And when you figure out how to do that, you can do that for a few. And once you figured out how to do it for a few, you can do it for many. Um, so the church doesn't frequently operate like that. I mean, most commonly, the church operates on what I like to call the Sermon on the Mount mentality, where this idea is let's gather many, many people together in a space and deliver a message to them. And the message can be life-giving, the message can be life-changing, the message can be incredible teaching. But ultimately, if you read Matthew's gospel, nowhere in the Gospel of Matthew, where the Sermon on the Mount is written down, does it say that anyone who listened to the Sermon on the Mount became a lifelong follower of Jesus? Um, in fact, the only reason we know what was said in the Sermon on the Mount is because Matthew wrote it down, and Matthew was one of the 12. See, I would argue that Jesus's large group ministry, his ministry to the masses, was actually a considerable failure. Um, and I might sound like a heretic for that. I mean, if you're a theologian on the call, you might be screaming at your screen and say, no, his large group ministry had purpose. Yeah, it did have purpose. But ultimately, the crowds turned on him and had him killed. I mean, he lost the crowds many times over. I don't care how bad of a homilist someone might be. No one has ever walked out of a homily and said, we should kill the priest. At least I hope that has not happened. I mean, Jesus was, his message resonated with some, but ultimately turned the crowds on him. But I would say that his 3-year ministry wasn't a failure, but that in actuality, his ministry on earth, his ministry to the church was a tremendous success. You can look at the long-term fruit of it. Our church still exists to this day because of what Jesus did. And so what I would argue is that Jesus's focus in his ministry wasn't really on the crowds. If the crowds had a purpose and what he did for the crowds had a purpose, but ultimately his focus was in on 12. And even among 12, there was 3, and even among 3, there was 1. See, Jesus' mindset, like there was a divine plan to conquer the world. And it was a perfect plan. Like God came to earth with the intention of establishing a church that would spread the gospel to the entire world. And he was successful at it. So what did that plan entail? It was focused in on one person. See, the way that God operates is he doesn't look out into the crowd and see a crowd. He looks out into the crowd and singles out Simon the fisherman. And he asks himself the question, well, what is it going to take to make Simon the fisherman into a great saint? And when he figures that out, when he figures out how to take Simon the fisherman and turn him into St. Peter, he moves from 1 to 3, Peter, James, and John, and from 3 to 12, and from 12 to 72, and so on and so forth. Like that is the divine plan to conquer the world. Jesus spoke about the one frequently. I mean, if you look at his approach with different people, he had a life-changing conversation sitting at the well with the Samaritan woman. His focus on her was, his message to her was for her in that moment. Jesus spoke about how the good shepherd leaves the 99 in search of the one. And so I've spoken on this idea of Jesus having an individualized approach before. And I actually saw somebody write in the comment section one time on a message that I gave. They said, I turned him off when he said, meaning my talk. I turned it off as soon as he said Jesus is only focused on one. He's like, Jesus came for all of us. I'm like, of course he came for all of us. But you have to understand, Jesus has an approach. Jesus has an individualized approach to bringing the gospel to you, to making you a great saint. That's intended for you and you alone. Like he knows each of his sheep by name. And he has a journey and a walk and an approach that is intended for every single one of his sheep. The millions, if not billions, if not trillions of us who live. Jesus has a focused individual approach for you. Now, accompaniment is a buzzword in the church. Pope Francis was big on the term accompaniment. And Jesus was certainly someone who embodied accompaniment in what he did. What is accompaniment? Like in large part, like this presentation is how do you walk with a loved one who has left the faith? All I'm going to talk about for the remainder of this presentation is essentially accompaniment. How do you do accompaniment? Um, so what is it? Well, I think Jesus embodies accompaniment. Like the perfect example of it is the approach that he takes. And again, he has a journey and an approach that he takes with each individual. And he has an approach that he takes with the two men walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus after the resurrection. He comes across these two people journeying away from Jerusalem. And and he asks if he can walk with him. And they're talking about the events that have been happening over the last few days. And Jesus essentially asks, knowing full well what they're talking about. They're talking about him, but they don't recognize him. And he says, what are you talking about? And they're like, are you the only one who hasn't heard what's going on? Like, word has spread. Jesus, who many thought was the Messiah, was crucified. And now 3 days later, his body is missing, and his followers are saying that he has resurrected from the dead. And so they tell him this whole thing, and he just continues to walk with them and listen. And he allows them to tell their story of what's going on. Now, something that is not frequently talked about is that the two followers walking to Emmaus are walking the wrong direction. What do I mean by that? God has been spotted in Jerusalem. All the action is happening in Jerusalem. Now, they may have had business to attend to in Emmaus, and that's why they were leaving Jerusalem. But essentially, they're walking away from God. They're walking away from where Jesus has been spotted. And so, what does Jesus do? He walks with them in the wrong direction. He accompanies them. And eventually they start asking him questions, and he starts opening the scriptures to them. And in conversation and in relationship, their eyes are opened. And eventually they come to see him in the breaking of the bread. The famous story of the road to Emmaus. This is what accompaniment is it's less about saying to someone like, I'm going to teach you about the faith. Uh, it's more about saying, I recognize that you're on a journey. Can I walk with you? And in doing so, what you essentially anticipate is that your witness is going to be the thing that brings up the conversation, that brings up the dialogue. Your witness, the person who you are, the sainthood that you strive for, and are the piety that you live, is going to be the thing that catches their attention as you develop a relationship with them. I'm a firm believer that we have, going back to what I do for the church, where I advocate for a change in focus in the way that we do ministry with young people. I'm a firm advocate that the greatest myth that we have been come to believe in the church for the last several centuries is that if the faith were simply understood, if the teachings of Jesus were understood, it would be self-evident to us why we should follow, which is so not the case. It is not enough to simply learn the teachings of Christianity. It doesn't become self-evident to someone why Christianity is true. In fact, Christianity is something that has to be witnessed. It has to be lived. It has to be seen. You have to see people who are living as true disciples and hear about their own experiences of prayer and encounter with Christ and so on and so forth. That's what is necessary in order to make disciples. Like I'm a firm believer that it is impossible to communicate to someone who God is outside of the context of a relationship. Because who God is a relationship. He is a relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so frequently what we do in the church is we try to communicate to people who God is, and we don't do so in a relationship. And so what Jesus embodies here in accompaniment in the road to Emmaus is he forms a relationship with these men, and through the relationship, they come to see him and know him eventually in the breaking of the bread. The church has a long history of talking about the need for witness, the need for people to see the faith and understood in order for it to be understood. I love this quote by Pope Paul VI, where he says, "Modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers." And if he listens to teachers, it is because they are witnesses. So, the church has been saying for a long time. Pope Francis talked about this. John Paul II talked about it. Benedict XVI talked about it. I mean, there's a long line of history of like the church needs more than anything witnesses to the faith, and then for those witnesses to accompany people. I was speaking at a conference one time, and somebody asked me during a Q&A session, they said, how can you tell whether a Catholic organization has an attitude or a temperament of discipleship? Uh, and I was like, oh, that's a really good question. And I thought about it for a second. I said, here's what I would say. I would ask the leader, and this is my favorite question to ask priests or bishops, but because obviously they're heads of large organizations. I know that's a terrible term, terrible way to describe the church. It's not an organization, but you know, for the purposes of this conversation, they're heads of church. But I like to ask them, anyone who's the head of a Catholic organization, name for me 3 people by their first name that you are intentionally walking with, that you are intentionally discipling, that you know their story, you're forming a relationship with them, and you're intentionally walking with them. If you can't name for me 3 people, then you're not an organization that prioritizes discipleship. And the command of Jesus for everyone, the very nature of the church, the very mission of the church, is to go and make disciples of all nations. Jesus commanded, it wasn't a light suggestion, it was a command to all of us to go and make disciples. If you can't name the people that you are intentionally making disciples, then you're not doing what Jesus asked of you. So all of this to say, okay, let's say, for example, you have a loved one. You say, look, the person I want to build a relationship with, to walk with, to journey with in terms of their faith is a loved one who has left. My adult child, my current, children's children, my neighbor, my siblings, my parents, whatever the case may be. What do I do? How do I walk with them? It, there's a variety of strategies that I can give you. But I want to talk about the one that I think is most foundational, which is to have the temperament of a Messiah, or temperament of the Messiah. I don't want you to develop a Messiah complex. You're not the savior of the world. But what was the temperament of Jesus? I find the way that he works with lepers to be really fascinating, because uh, according to the custom of the time, like leprosy was a terrible disease to get. It was very contagious, and it was essentially would cause your skin to rot. And the idea was that if you touched a person who had leprosy, you might get it yourself. You would become unclean. And so, what a horrible way to live, in that, like, those who had leprosy had to live in colonies, live in community with one another, and were not allowed to touch another human being, which is just awful to think about. But I understand it. Like, it's a highly contagious disease. This is what we did during COVID. It was separate, stay away from each other. It's not a fun way to live. But the idea was that if you touch someone with leprosy, you would become unclean. Look at what Jesus does with the lepers. What does he do with them? When he encounters a leper, he goes to the leper and he embraces them. He immediately touches them. Which would, according to the custom and according to just common thought, would make him unclean. I mean, they would make the lepers live in colonies with one another, and when they were moving as a colony from place to place, they had to shout "unclean" at people in order to tell them, "Stay away from me." And Jesus does the opposite. He doesn't stay away from them. He moves closer to them. He touches them. He embraces them, and then something interesting happens. Instead of him becoming unclean and impure, rather than him becoming impure, they receive and catch his purity. Rather than him becoming impure, they become pure by nature of touching him, which is amazing. And the reason why I find the way that he works with lepers to be interesting is because this is also the way Jesus works with sinners. It's identical. Um, he enters into the world of sin by becoming human. And the one thing that he doesn't share with us is sin. But he enters into a world that is just surrounded by sin. He's just surrounded by leprosy all the time. And so what does he do to the sinner? Common thought. Honestly, I still see this to this day in the church. It's very common, is that when we see sinners, we say to them, stay away from us. You are unclean. And we make them shout at us, unclean. I mean, heck, what did Simon the fisherman, who became Saint Peter, what's the first thing he does when he realizes that Jesus is the Messiah after the miracle of the multiplication of fish? Uh, he shouts at Jesus, he falls to his knees and he says, depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinner. He basically, just like a leper, he says to him, unclean, get away from me. And this, honestly, to this day, we do this in the church all the time. You can think of what would happen in the doors of our church if two gay men were to walk in holding hands. They would probably be, I would hope that some Christians in the pews would be welcoming and would embrace them and would welcome them into community, recognizing that people don't walk in perfect. People walk in seeking the Lord and need to be accompanied. But in all honesty, I know that in my parish, if that were to happen, there would be some stares. There would be some scowling and some dirty looks. We do this in the church all the time. Jesus goes to the sinner and he embraces them. And instead of him catching their sinfulness, they receive purity and the forgiveness of their sins. This is the temperament of Messiah. And so this is the mindset that you have to have when you're walking with someone who has left the faith. Why do I say this? Look, I cannot tell you how many parents I know who have the best of intentions and their adult children have left the faith. And they come to me and they might ask some advice. And I say, look, here's the advice I would give you. Don't ever talk about the gospel with them ever again. And the parents kind of look at me with a shocked look, like, why wouldn't I do, like, what we need to do is preach the gospel to them. I'm like, I believe you probably have been preaching the gospel to them. And probably the thing that they need more than anything is for someone to stop preaching at them and start accompanying them. I actually have a hard rule with my extended family. Certainly in my own family, my children, my spouse, etc. We talk about the gospel all the time, but I have a hard rule with extended family, cousins and siblings, and you know, people, parents, whatever the case may be. I never bring up faith with them ever. Everyone knows I work for the church. I do evangelization. I'm a professional in it. I never, ever, ever bring up faith with them. And a big part of the reason for that is because of the fact that I want to be approachable. Like, I actually have conversations with the loved ones all the time, extended family all the time, about faith, but I'm never the one who brings it up. It's brought up by them. And it's because I want to be non-threatening. I want to be approachable. I once had an uncle that cussed in front of me. And then he saw that I was standing next to him and he turned and he like apologized. And I was like, for what? Like, I appreciate it. I appreciate it, but you don't think I've heard four-letter words before? Like, look, you don't think I've used four-letter words before? I don't condone it, but just the idea that I was like so above him in virtue that he had to apologize. I was like, I don't want that kind of reputation. I want to be approachable, and so I mean, there has to be a temperament of a Messiah, somebody who's willing to walk with these people. Now, the other thing I'll say to parents who might be on the call and say, like, look, if you have an adult child who's left the faith, my first recommendation is don't talk about the faith with them, which seems counterintuitive. But my second recommendation to the parent is just spend time with them and journey with them and love them. And the reason being is that a parent can fulfill a role in a person's life that nobody else can fulfill. We teach in our church that parents are the primary educators of the faith. The first catechist, I think, is the term that is frequently used. Now, I hear the word primary, and first certainly means like perhaps most important. It's the one they learn the most from. It's their responsibility more than anyone else. But I hear the word primary, and I just hear the word first. I once was talking to a psychologist, Catholic psychologist, and we got on the conversation of parents, and I said, I bet you have a lot of people that come in and complain about their parents, or working through wounds from their upbringing with their parents. And he says, sure, that's common. He says, you know what's interesting to me? This is what the therapist is saying to me. And I said, what? He says, the way people perceive who God is also like is identical to how they were raised. Meaning that however they translate, like however they were raised by their parents, is how they also translate who God is. So if their parents were strict authoritarians, they believe that God is a strict authoritarian and they're very rigid on rules, on following rules in the church, on following disciplines and practices, the scrupulosity, etc. If they have parents who were absent in their life, they frequently you'll find people who believe that God is not there. Or if they have parents who are negligent, they believe God is not interested. Um, if they have parents who acted like their best friend but didn't provide um, an actual parental relationship, they tend to have the mindset of Jesus is my homeboy. But if a parent is someone who provided an environment of unconditional love for their child, then they tend to have a view of God as someone who loves unconditionally. And so this is what I tell parents is I'm like, look, don't talk about the faith with your children, with your adult children who've left, and then spend time loving them unconditionally. Spend time in relationship with them. Spend time not judging them or the decisions that they've made or the way that they're living their life, but spend time walking with them and loving them unconditionally, because no one else in their life can fulfill that role like you can. And it's like, oh, look, they need someone to preach the gospel to them. But I trust that the Lord will put that person in their life. They also need someone to show them what love is. And you as a parent are better positioned to do that than anyone else. I once asked a parent uh, I was a youth minister at a parish many, many years ago, and there was a parent who had like 8 adult children, and they were all incredible, faithful children. So some of them grew up and had their own families, were devout, practicing the faith in the pews. So she had a couple that were in seminary. She had another one, I think, that was discerning religious life. And I pulled the mom aside and I was like, what did you do? Like, what's the secret? Because your kids are amazing. So what did you do? What did you figure out that everybody else hasn't figured out? And she gave the most profound answer I've ever heard from a parent. Best advice I've ever received. She said, I had to come to grips with the fact that it was okay for Jesus to be their savior. Meaning, I had to come to grips with the fact that it was okay for Jesus to be their savior. I had to let them sin. I had to let them stray. I had to let them walk away. I had to let them, go searching for God in places where I don't want them searching. And I had to trust, which is hard to do as a parent, that the path that they were going that I didn't want them going down, Jesus was going to chase after them. And he was going to fulfill his promise to me, of being their savior. Like it is because of their fall into sin, that they came to find Jesus and turn to him. That is a tough thing to do as a parent. We don't want our children to fall. We want them to follow Christ. Um, but so the advice I give to parents, I'm like, look, don't talk about faith. Love them unconditionally. Trust that Jesus will be their savior. I once said to my mom, because my sister had left the faith, she made her way back. It took 15 years, but she made her way back. I once said to my mom, gave her the advice. I was like, don't talk to Vern about faith ever again. And I once said to her, I was like, Mom, you might have to come to grips with the fact that the next time my sister comes to Mass might be your funeral. And that's okay. Like if that's the next Mass that they attend, meaning that you'll never live to see it, Jesus will still work with that and can bring them back. I mean, ultimately, the end goal is that they're saints by the time they die. So it makes no difference whether they whether they live the saintly life that, well, it does make a difference. We certainly want them to live a saintly life their entire life. But if they have conversion and they turn to Christ and they receive the sacraments at death, same effect. they find Christ in the end. So ultimately, like that is the temperament of of the Messiah. Walk with them, love them unconditionally, embrace the sinner. So what's the? I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and can I do that, Aaron, and bring my face back up?
You sure can.
Okay. And is my face back up or no? There it
Your
is. Okay,
face is back up. Yep.
great. So how? What's the limit on that? I was at a conference, I think back in July, and I was giving this presentation, and honestly, still workshopping the presentation, so it wasn't like fine-tuned. And we got to the Q&A section, and immediately at this conference, somebody gave me a difficult question. They said, if you were a parent and your child was getting married outside of the church, would you go to the wedding? And again, the name of this talk was how to walk with a loved one um, back to the faith. And what I had just talked about was radical accompaniment on loving them unconditionally. And so immediately I was like, yeah, I would go. Um, like I see my role as a parent there is even if they're getting married outside the church, I want to be they need to know that their parent loves them unconditionally, and will be there even if they're going down a road that I don't want them going down. And then they just kept upping the stakes, and they were like, "What if it was a gay wedding?" And I was like, I would still go. And they just kind of kept pushing me to see, is there a line? Now, look, here's the first thing I'll say. There's always a line in terms of walking with someone in the wrong direction. And you can set the line anywhere. Uh, Now, that being said, when you're walking with a loved one the wrong direction, it's up to you when you stop accompanying them. Is there any limit to how far I would go? For my own children? I don't know. I'll tell you how far that this got in the Q&A section. The person said, what if your daughter was getting an abortion and wanted you to come with her to the abortion clinic and hold her hand? They were like, would you go? And I was like, um, I was like, okay, where is my limit? And I was kind of put on the spot, and I was like, well, this talk is how to walk with a loved one. I was like, sure, let's just say I go. There were like gasps in the room, like audible gasps. And I was like, I'm never getting invited back to this conference ever again because of the way I'm answering these questions. But I'm like, okay, you could. There is a line you can draw in the sand. I think that there is a time to draw a line in the sand to give witness. But there's also something to be said for, hey, there's how far are you willing to go and walk with someone? So let me just put this in perspective. Let's take the most radical thing I can think of. Your daughter comes to you and says to you, Dad, I'm pregnant. I'm not going to keep the child. I'm going to get an abortion. I would like your support in this. What would I do if that was my situation? What I would actually do, I don't know. But let's just take this to its radical idea. What would radical accompaniment look like in this situation? Well, if I were attempting radical accompaniment, I might say to my daughter, let me explain to you the value of life. Let me give witness to how incredible parenthood is, how it is the most difficult job you'll ever love, how incredible life is. I wasn't a believer in love at first sight until I had my three children. I mean, let me talk about the value of life in general and give witness to it in my own life. And we might have that conversation. She might say, Dad, I understand, and I'm still going to go. So then what's my next approach? Radical accompaniment, let's just say we're doing that. Okay, honey, I'll go with you. Now, why would I do that? Well, first off and foremost, I know that young women who are going to have an abortion will frequently change their mind in the moment. And so who do I want them? I mean, I mean, if I'm going to go to the appointment, first thing I'm calling the Sisters of Life and I'm asking them to pray and intercede. I might go to my local priest and say, hey, can I bring the Eucharist with me? I don't even know if that's allowed, but let's just say I'll bring the Eucharist with me in my pocket so I know Jesus is with us. I hold my daughter's hand. Who's going to have a better chance of reaching my daughter and helping to guide her to turn around? Me, the man that she knows and that she loves and trusts to accompany her, or the sidewalk counselor that's got 5 seconds at best, who's a total stranger and try to make an appeal to change your mind and turn around. I have a better chance. And let's say we get into the waiting room and she's still kind of thinking about it. Let's say that in that moment she says to herself, you know what, I don't think I can do this. Do I want the voice that she hears to be my own voice saying, grab my hand and I'll walk with you out of here? Or do I want the voice that she hears to be the Planned Parenthood nurse who says, honey, that's why pencils have erasers. It's okay. Doubts are what everybody has. You'll feel better when it's all over. I want her to hear my voice. And let's say she gets on the table and she decides to go through with it. And she doesn't even, she's starting to have doubts and she doesn't even know if she has the strength to get off. I want to be there to be able to say, you can still walk out. And let's go as far as to say that she still goes through with it. What do I do then? If that's the case where I'm actually in the room witnessing it happening, have everyone praying, and she still goes through with it, and my heart is breaking because of it, I need her as my daughter to hear the words and to know I still love you, because I don't want to lose her soul as well. I need her to hear from a parent, because there will be a time when she realizes what she does, and she might believe God cannot forgive me, God does not love me because of what I did. I need her to hear from me, the person who's the primary educator of the faith, the person who embodies who God is in her mind and life. I need her to hear, I still love you. That's what radical accompaniment. Now, would I do that as a parent? Would I actually walk with my daughter into the abortion clinic? I don't know. I pray I never have to make that decision. But if this presentation is on how do you actually walk with a loved one who's left the faith, how far would you go? I think that's a fair question to ask. A little bit lighter story, not as dramatic as that, but I have walked with loved ones back into the faith. I'll tell you, just wrap this up and we'll go to some Q&A. My father-in-law, when I first met him, I was dated my high school married my high school sweetheart. So I've known him for a long, long time. When I first met him, he was an atheist. Engineer, very logical, practical brain, just really bad, though very, very much. I've always, like I found in when I taught RCIA for a year, and I had a couple of engineers in the group, like engineers need to question everything. They have that they have that like lot like I must know this is true before I submit to it. And so he had that kind of a brain. Um, and my first year of college, actually, after just one semester of college, I think I had one theology course. He picks my wife and I, my girlfriend at the time, up from college, and we had a 3-hour drive back home. And knowing that I was studying theology, and we had a 3-hour drive, almost and probably out of boredom or just trying to make conversation, he starts questioning me about God and belief. And we ended up having like a good long 3 hour, probably 3-hour conversation. And I was 18 years old with one semester of theology. Didn't stand a chance. And I just did the best that I could. In terms of answering his questions and trying to debate back and forth with him. My now wife cornered me afterwards and said to me, hey, I can't, like, he never talks about faith with me. I can't do it with him. Like, I'm too close to him. So if he ever has any chance of coming into the church and believing in God, you're going to have to do it. And I was like, okay. And little did I know that that's actually like would become our relationship. So I continued to date this girl. We eventually get married. Every 2 to 3 years, he would bring up that conversation. I'd never, ever in the 20 plus years that I've known him brought up faith, even though this is what I do for a living. Um, every 3 years or so, he would start a conversation with, hey, remember that car ride we had on the way back from college? And I'd say, yeah. He's like, I got a few more questions for you. And we set his time aside and we'd have like an hour-long discussion on his questions. And it's like clockwork. It was like every 3 years. And it would always start. He just did it to me like a year ago. He was like, I got a few more questions for you. Actually, 3 years ago, I was like, so what are your questions this time? And it was on transubstantiation and on the nature of like the Holy Trinity, how that actually works. Thank God at that point I have a master's degree of theology, because like those are not easy questions. But over the course of time, I would ask him in these conversations, I'm like, where are you at right now? And he went from being an atheist to an agnostic, and then eventually from an agnostic to a believer in God, and then eventually from an agnostic to a believer in God to as he called it, a practicing Catholic who struggles with some of the basic teachings. And that was a few years ago. And I was like, hey, we're getting there. Like, there was I got the pleasure of watching and seeing and viewing his journey along the way. Um, about probably almost a year ago at this point, he got the news that his heart was failing, and they gave him roughly about 6 months to live. And we knew this was coming. It was not news, but his health was failing. Um, and sure enough, as the months went on, he began to deteriorate. And um, as we were getting down to where we thought he might have weeks to live, I asked him, probably the only time I ever actually brought up faith with him. I said, Craig, do you have any interest before you die in receiving sacraments, receiving anointing the sick, talking to a priest, receiving the Eucharist, etc.? Now, he had not received any sacraments probably since his first Holy Communion. Um, and so, 50 to 60 years, probably he would go to mass, but he would not receive because he was not willing or ready to admit like that is Jesus. Um, and so 50, 60 years without the sacraments, without sacrament of grace. I said, are you ready? Like, are you interested in receiving the sacraments before you die? And he says, yeah, I am. And so we had a priest come, and 60 years without the Eucharist. He receives the Eucharist for the first time in 60 years. He receives anointing of the sick. He receives he does the sacrament of reconciliation, so forgiveness of sins he receives, 60-year confession. And then a few weeks later, he passed away. We got him there at the end of his life. It was a long journey. It was a long accompaniment. Um, but it just goes to show it's like, hey, if you're willing, I have similar stories with many different people in my life, people that I've taken long walks with, and just pick up the conversation every few years. And it's amazing to see what Jesus is doing and the little part that I get to play along the journey, but how necessary it is for them to have a relationship and a person they can talk to. Um, I've long said like evangelization. Oh, here I'll wrap up with this story. Evangelization is kind of like a story of like if you're ever going to be an effective evangelist. I once saw a movie. Now You See Me was the movie. Actually the third. They're making it into a trilogy. The third movie is coming out in November. It's like Ocean's 11 meets David Copperfield. So it's like magicians who rob banks. So the whole premise of the movie is ridiculous, but it's actually really entertaining. Um, in the first movie, all these magicians talked about was a um, magician who had passed away, who was legendary in the magician community. His name was Lionel Shrike, and the reason why he was legendary was because of a trick that he pulled off um, over the course of a period of time. And it basically, as the story goes, a man came, I think a politician came to his town. And he approached him as a young magician and said, "Can I do a card trick for you?" And he does a card trick, and with the card trick, he has him write his name in the middle of a card that he pulls out of the deck, and does sleight of hand and does a variety of different tricks with that card, and then wishes the man, on his merry way or whatever the case may be, and says goodbye. Now, the point of the trick, the point of that was not to impress the man with some card tricks. The point was to try to get his signature on a card. And so he takes that card and he puts it into a tree. Actually, he puts it in a glass case, and he puts that glass case into the knot of a tree, and just leaves it there for 30 years. And over the course of 30 years, this tree grows, the knot closes up, and the glass case with the card in it is in the middle of this large tree that has grown in this park. 30 years later, the same man comes back to town, much more important than this time. He approaches him and says, "Can I do a card trick for you?" The man has long forgotten about the forgettable sleight of hand tricks that he did 30 years ago. And so he, using sleight of hand, makes sure that the guy pulls out the exact same card that he pulled out 30 years ago, writes his name in the exact same place, uses sleight of hand to make it disappear, basically pockets the card. And then he says, "Your card is now growing in the middle of that tree." And he has them cut down the tree. And everyone was astonished to see the man's card with his name written in it inside a glass case with all kinds of vines and the wood and the tree growing around it. They didn't realize it was the card from 30 years earlier. So the man had a 30-year plan and had to wait 30 years to see this trick play out. It became a legend because of it. If you're ever going to be an effective evangelist and you want to go after the most difficult people, you have to have a 30-year approach and be willing to walk with them along the journey. That's what it actually takes to walk with someone who has left the faith. I guess we got like 15 minutes left or so. So Aaron, I'm going to hand it back over to you, and we can do some. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to field them.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. You had me weeping over here uh, with your stories, with your storytelling. I appreciate your perspective and your sharing that with us. I know this is one of the most difficult things parents do, teachers, I'm sure, ministry leaders. How can we reach these individuals? And so you've helped us with that. I've gotten some comments and things about prayer, right? And how prayer is involved in all of that. What might you say on that?
So yeah, I mean, I just talked about the temperament of the Messiah. There's the book we're going to plug at the end of this is a book that I wrote called One Disciple at a Time. In that, I actually lay out 7 different strategies. And usually the strategies build on each other. And having the temperament of the Messiah is just like the first chapter, essentially. So if you want, buy the book, you'll get some good strategies. But one of the things that I talk about, prayer is essential. We all love the story of Saint Monica and praying her son Saint Augustine into sainthood. He had a child out of wedlock. He was famously unchaste. He was a drunkard, and so on and so forth. And she prayed and she prayed and she prayed. And I think sometimes what gets glossed over in the story of Saint Monica is just how much she suffered. Um, she waited for years and years and years praying. So if you are praying for your child or praying for your loved one, please continue to pray and understand that those prayers are absolutely essential and valuable. In fact, I usually start with, this talk was on how you actually walk with someone, but I usually start with when I'm telling a parent, look, pray for your child. And I feel like that should be, um, uh, it should go without saying. But it's also amazing to me how many parents I know that don't actually do it. And I'm like, okay, if you're not praying for your child, who is? Like, no one in their life is more motivated, should be more motivated to pray for them than you. So if you don't have a set time set aside every day to pray for each of your children, do so. Like, I know with my parents, they pray the rosary every day, and I get the 3rd decade of their rosary. Or it's one of the decades. I'm just making 3rd decade up, but they pray for me and my intentions and my family and so on and so forth on that decade every day. It's like, pray for your children. Intercessory prayer is so valuable, so essential. So yeah, prayer is you can't do anything with it. God's the one who does the work of conversion. So praying for him to be working and acting is invaluable.
Mm-hmm. And trusting in that too. Here's a kind of a comment question. If someone who left the faith and adopted a non-denominational faith, who has strong opinions they've adopted against the Catholic faith from their friend group influences, won't be open to hearing anything about the Catholic religion they grew up in. And then I expect something like, is the comment, whatever brings you closer to God is okay, even if it is a different religion? Is an appropriate
Well, are we talking, when we say non-denominational, are we still talking Christian?
No, I think they said also, well, here, also, would that apply to a Muslim or non-believer?
Look, I mean, we're going to get into teachings in Vatican II here on where you can essentially talk about like Jesus in the middle, the church is the closest circle, and then you get further and further out in terms of circles of truth. How far does Jesus's mercy extend? Don't know. I tend to think that he is pretty merciful, but you get into the question of, hey, the Muslim who believes in God actually believes in the right God, still wrong religion, in terms of fullness of truth, but never actually heard the gospel message. Does that person go to hell? It's like, well, I wouldn't think so, but ultimately we entrust those cases to God and His mercy. Um, my first question when somebody has left the faith, when has left Catholicism, is, hey, why? And it's more of it's not a, hey, I want to get into this and debate you. I think the biggest mistake you can make when you're is putting on your Catholic Answers ball cap and saying, I'm going to go take somebody out to lunch and we're going to have this fierce debate. Seldom do I meet someone who says, I came back to the church because somebody argued me there.
Mhm.
Occasionally you'll meet somebody who has got that kind of it, but most people's block in terms of why they left the faith and why they're not coming back is usually actually not intellectual. Um, that person who's intellectual, like, yeah, they might have an argument that somebody can make, and in all honesty, the argument one might be better made by a priest, by a theologian, by someone who can explain some of the differences. But honestly, like, usually the reason why they left is because someone in the Catholic Church hurt them. And so the most valuable thing you can do for someone who has left the Catholic faith and because someone in the church has hurt them is form a relationship where you love the person, and they see that not all Catholics are bad. Not all Catholics are like that person who hurt them. Like, that can be a starting point, and you don't know where it goes from there. But it's like, okay, what I'd encourage you to do is build a relationship and let your faith do the talking in the way that you love the person. Start there and see where it goes from there.
Mhm.
And it's perfectly fair to ask the question, hey, I'm just curious to know why you left. And if they tell you a story of like this is what happened in the Catholic Church and I got hurt because of it, to express sorrow and grief that happened. That the best advice I could give in 2 minutes.
Mhm. Absolutely. What are some strategies you might give to a youth minister? You said you did youth ministry, right?
Yeah, go to andrew-ministries.com
Uh-huh.
and reach out to me on your contact form, and we'll set up a 30-minute call and talk about all things youth ministry. In all honesty, youth ministry is dying in the church, badly needs to change. That's what my entire apostolate is directed at. Um, and it's just not going to work the way we've been doing it for decades. What I would say is focus on small group discipleship. There's a variety of ways you can build that. But ultimately, you need a team of people in your parish, as many people as possible, to be investing in a few. And so if you don't have people in your pews that are devout, faithful Catholics, you can't do youth ministry. If you do, then the best thing you can do is put young people in relationship with them so they can see what the faith actually looks like.
Mhm.
That's my 60-second shtick. And then, yeah, I mean, the art of forming young disciples, why youth ministries aren't working and what to do about it. It's not an Ave Maria Press book,
That's
but
okay.
it is a book that I wrote with Sophia that you could purchase and gives you more of my thoughts on youth ministry.
Mhm. Absolutely. And then I know you talked a lot about parents, and so that's the other thing with ministry leaders, right? How can they help form the parents to accompany instead of just looking maybe at how that child is going wayward, right? Or
The long term goal, really, in terms of transforming ministry to young people in the church, is to build up parents. The challenge that I see and have with taking that approach exclusively of like, let's build up incredible parents, is like, well, what do you do for those kids that don't come from a devout, faithful Catholic family? It's like, we're called to evangelize. And honestly, the best way to reach parents who are nominally Catholic or who are on the fringes or who are not Catholic at all is through their children, because they won't come to things that are for them in terms of ministry, but they'll come to things that are for their children.
Mhm.
So building an incredible youth ministry is actually a great doorway into building an incredible parent ministry, which then reinforces and develops a greater youth ministry. But
Mhm.
I digress. If you wind me up and get me going, we'll talk about that for another hour. So,
Okay,
uh,
well, maybe that'll be the next webinar.
yeah.
Well, Everett, thank you so much. As you know, I always enjoy having you, present a webinar with us and sharing your experience and your faith and your passion for what you do. And so I will add to the follow-up email tomorrow a link to Andrew Ministries so that you all can check it out and see what that has to offer. The book, absolutely, as Everett was talking about, One Disciple at a Time, you can purchase it at Ave Maria Press using code webinar 1007 for today's date, and get 20% off. So you said there's 7 strategies in the book, 7 steps, 7.
Yeah, 7 strategies, and then I think final chapter, I talk about how you can actually implement them into a larger movement in your parish and your ministries and in your life in general. My hope with that book was that people would read it and say, oh, this is easy. I'm going to go and actually make it my goal to focus in on a single person. And if everybody did that, then the church would grow.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, well, thank you, everybody. And we're going to kind of stay on this topic a little bit for next week, too. We've got Jennifer Stavanoa, who's a ministry leader, writer, and a content creator for Ablaze Ministries. We're going to continue talking about how parishes can partner with parents to pass on the faith. So hope you will join us next week. Thank you. Thanks again, Everett. See you soon.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks for having me.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.